Today, we're going to be talking about the Republican Party, its current performance in the eyes of Gen Z voters. Ideally, this is going to be part of a larger series of discussions between Gen Z writers, influencers, activists, people from across the political spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, centrists, everything in between, so long, of course, as you're not a violent, bigoted extremist. If that applies to you, sorry, we don't really want to hear from you. Now, the voices that we're going to be bringing to the table here would be dedicated to civil discussion, to shared pro-democracy values, and to breaking down echo chambers. Basically, the opposite of the mess we saw during the last presidential debate. I think we can kind of all acknowledge that, irrespective of our partisan affiliation. Now, I'm going to be the moderator for the discussion today. My name is Sam Taylor. I am a student and Gen Z voter. It's about all you really need to know. And if you couldn't tell, kind of appalled at the extremely polarized state of our current political climate. Today, I'm joined by Tanya Ruidis, Connor Chung, and Jasne Cezanne, who are going to be discussing the state of the Republican Party and their differing views on that. So that's really enough of me talking. I'm going to turn things over to Tanya to start us off. Now, Tanya, if I'm not mistaken, your position on this subject overall is that the Republican Party has actually been doing quite a bit that is favorable to Gen Z. What exactly would you mean by that? And how is that going to be represented, or how should it be represented in the Republican convention that's going to be starting on Monday?
Right off the bat, the Republican convention, like as a whole, even the party, needs to be adapting to the multimedia mediums that the Democratic Party is also, right? Like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram Reels. That is where they're lacking. But nonetheless, what they're doing good is in illustrating what the American dream is and how it could be attained by Gen Z, right? They have painted this narrative that the left is a bit too cynical when it comes to these issues, but they are the hope that Gen Z wants. And I'm really, when I say Gen Z, I'm talking about mostly about those first generation Gen Z Americans, right? They're filled with hope by their immigrant parents. So they're really leaning into the Republican Party values and in hopes that they can secure their own American dream. So that's what they're really doing good in really illustrating for the Gen Z voters what they can give and what the left can't give, right? They're again painting that picture that the left is too cynical, going bit too negative and not really seeing the hope in the world that's there, right? So the Republican Party is trying to be the hope that Gen Z wants, right? Primarily, they're focusing on Black and Hispanic voters this coming election. So we do see that shift happening, and notably, we do see Black and Hispanic voters leaning a bit more into the Republican Party, right? Which is a surprising thing, right? Democratic Party has really been dependent on Black and Hispanic voters, but they're not really focusing on the issues that Black and Hispanic voters want, right? But we do see that the Republican Party is, for example, they're focusing on jobs, job market, inflation, the economy, and the left is focusing a bit too much on identity politics, which isn't their biggest issue, right? They're focusing on how they're going to feed their family, how they're going to support their family. And we do see the Republican Party leaning into that type of argument, suggesting policies and such as. But what the Republican Party could be doing better in, again, is leading to those multimedia mediums like TikTok that the DNC is heavily in, right? Maybe Google, like some social media accounts, you see the DNC has, a lot of followers. They're constantly posting videos. Even the Human Rights Campaign is posting a lot of left-leaning videos. So they really need to lean into that and to get more, I guess, Gen Z Republicans into the mix.
If I'm understanding you correctly, we hear conservative commentators and Republican politicians talk a lot about, a quote unquote victimhood mentality or whatever else. And that it can be disempowering. And maybe the Republican Party's rhetoric is kind of steering away from that to empower Gen Z voters and others. I Just before we move on, I do kind of have a question. As I was going over some of the like the Republican Party platform that's been published in preparation for the upcoming convention, I'm seeing a lot of analyses on how that platform, at least according to some interpretations, could villainize immigrants and so forth. or kind of alienate those groups. We tend to see this a lot in analyses of Trump's rhetoric. What's your reaction to that? And do you think that that's a problem with Republican Party's rhetoric? Is it a misinterpretation of what's going on? And then we'll get some other people's thoughts here.
It's a little bit of both, right? You do have those in Republican Party who make these very stark comments that are going to take away their more conservative Black and Hispanic voters, right? So you could have conservative Hispanics, for example, but they will end up voting a Democratic candidate, right? Because you have those key figures who are saying those really, like, very dividing comments. But I do think that at the end of the day, we are seeing our first generation Hispanics. And when it comes to immigration, they're willing to vote right at the expense of hurting, like, I don't want to say their own community, but they're still willing to vote right because it's going to help them secure their own benefits, right? They want to improve themselves, so they're going to do that, right? So even in some cases, what the I don't want to say the far right, but there are some Republican commentators who are definitely making some comments that are concerning when it comes to immigration, but I still don't think that represents the whole party's platform, right? I think that's just something the left has been doing to, um, like, I guess, misconstruct what the right is actually saying when it comes to immigration policy.
Now, we'll turn over to Connor for a moment here. Connor, you've told me before that you think that the Republican Party is kind of over reliant on maybe what you call the neoconservative ideology, and that's a little outdated and it needs to move away from that. Can you describe kind of what your thoughts are there and your reaction to what Tanya's been saying about the current state of the Republican Party?
Yeah, first of all, I do agree with what Tanya has to say about the changing nature of Black and Hispanic voters. I totally agree with that. I think that a lot of these these younger second generation immigrants are looking at the economic realities on the ground, and you know identity politics is that's okay, when things are hunky dory. But when things aren't going so well and the economy is in the gutter and inflation is, running at all-time highs, then all of a sudden, identity politics becomes rather unimportant. And, regardless of skin color, people start to focus on things like Tanya said, putting bread on the table and, securing um, stable employment and protecting the American job market and so forth. And immigration is just one of those things that, regardless of creed or background, it has effects on everybody in America. And when you start to mess with people's ability to provide and their own economic well-being, then that's when you start running into trouble. So I definitely agree with that. In reference to neocons and neoconservatism, this is something that for me has been a huge issue in within the Republican Party itself. Uh, Even to this day, really, neoconservatism is still something that continues to really dominate the conservative political landscape in this country. This is a movement that started during the Cold War and basically developed this, militant ideology that essentially says that we need to use military force to promote democracy around the globe. And obviously, I think this is something that a lot of younger people, Gen Z included, have taken notice of. But that's an excuse that we're not buying anymore. Promoting democracy or protecting human rights is something. It's really just a code for expanding American global hegemony in places that it probably shouldn't be. I think since the collapse of the USSR in 91, America just got a little cocky. We just started trying our hand at all this ridiculous foreign policy in places that, frankly, we had no business being in, simply just because we could. And so we figured, why not try our hand at this stuff? And a lot of these these foreign policy excursions funded by American taxpayers have resulted in terrible misgivings and negative knock-on effects for the global economy and America's well-being as well. You know, we've essentially shot ourselves in the foot with a lot of these forever wars in places like Iraq and I mean in Libya in 2011. You know, the U.S. Has been accused of violating UN Resolution 1973, where essentially, you know, it allows coalition partners to intervene militarily to, you know, on the basis of human rights to protect civilians on the ground. And, you know, what does America do? You know, they turn around and they use that as grounds to launch an offensive war against Libya just because they could, just because, you know, regime change seems to be a national pastime these days in recent decades. And I think that where I'm going with this is that, you know, young voters and young conservatives, Gen Z conservatives, there's this emerging consensus that that conservatism is changing for us. You know, we don't identify with the neocon cause. We don't believe in this lie that we've been sold over the years. And I think that the fabric of conservatism is changing among young people, and we're kind of shifting away from that and more towards an isolationist sort of view, an inward-looking view. We're looking to fix America's issues. We have a lot of problems to take a look at home, you know, before we start messing around and tinkering with other people's dealings. So yeah, in that sense, I think things are changing among young conservatives.
I think you've answered kind of my follow-up question a little bit there, which was, is this shift already happening in the Republican Party more broadly? And based on what we're seeing with the, you know, what the was published, the platform that was published ahead of the convention, that does seem to be occurring. You know, I mean, a lot of Trump's rhetoric can be categorized as rather isolationist, inward-looking. Let's focus on America, stop being involved so much abroad. But I'm going to pose a similar question as to that which I posed to Tanya, because from a lot of people's perspectives, it does seem like this isolationist focus can almost be spurred on by, I don't know if disdain is the right word, or you know, like a villainization and so forth of people who are outside of America, people who are foreigners. You know, and we do see this occur a lot in the platform's rhetoric, in Trump's speech rhetoric, and so forth. So, similar question to what I posed to Tanya. Do you think that this shift away from neoconservatism and, you know, like kind of what the left labels as imperialism, is something that needs to be spurred on by, I guess, a fear of immigration, a fear of like foreign countries and so forth, and a villainization of that? And do you think that's what's happening in the Republican Party now, or do you think it's much more nuanced than that? Like, what's your thought there?
I think some of it is spurred on by like genuine, you know, anti-immigration sentiments. Definitely. I mean, for aforementioned reasons, you know, I think that, you know, like I said earlier, it really comes down to the economic well-being of a country. You know, when a country is doing well economically and wages are high and labor has more leverage over capital, or at least, you know, an even-headed relationship with it, then I think that's okay. But you know, Americans are really struggling, and so it's difficult for. I think on this is something that we're seeing bipartisan consensus on, even among young Americans. Well, actually, I think almost exclusively among young Americans. You know, I think older voters, especially baby boomers, are more in line with a bipartisan consensus on you know, neoconservatism, and that's something that you know, even on the left, there's bipartisan support for that historically over the years. Like strong military industrial complex. There's always been bipartisan support largely for America's foreign policy endeavors, whether it's on the right or the left. You might have some outliers, but I think among Gen Z, it's the opposite. You have bipartisan support against that and more of an inward looking model. And I really think it's just a reflection of the health of our country. I mean, we have eyes, we can, all you have to do is listen to the self-reporting that's going on and listen to what young Americans are telling you. The legacy media can go out there and they can publish articles through The Economist or Forbes or the Financial Times that all say things like, oh, the American economy hasn't done this well in decades. And I see articles like that all the time. And every time I look in the comments, it's young people who are saying, stop gaslighting us. That's not true. There's a popular saying out there that one of the easiest ways to lie is through statistics and through stats. And all these complex formulas that they derive to quantify inflation, and you can change all that stuff just based on formulas to placate public opinion. So all you have to do is listen to the self-reporting that's going on, especially among young Americans, and they'll tell you that things are not okay. I can tell you right now, a basket of goods feels generally about 20 or 25% more expensive than it was 4 or 5 years ago. So of course people aren't going to believe our institutions when they come out and say, oh, inflation is back down to like 4%, like we're almost back down to our target. So I think a lot of this isolationism is from the right. It's coming from a perspective of economic well-being and that sort of America first mentality, and on the left, I think it comes from more of like a humanitarian, like a social issues aspect, where the young left is concerned with human rights in places like Gaza and the war in Yemen that's killed over 370,000 civilians, sanctioned and sponsored by the U.S. government and its allies in the Gulf. And I could go on and on about these human rights issues and the ethical misgivings of the American government and its foreign policy in recent years. So that's where the left's gripe comes from. But regardless of the reason, young Americans are I think, just unilaterally kind of supporting this push towards a more inward-looking focus. So we'll see if that continues to manifest. I mean, obviously, you said we've seen a lot of that rhetoric with Donald Trump, and it seems to be resonating with this new brand of conservatism that's arisen since he entered the political landscape.
Thank you, Connor. So, Tanya, if you'd like to hold that thought really quickly, I do see your hand up. We're going to go to Jasne really quick to see kind of what your reaction is to what's been discussed so far and what your perception of the Republican Party's performance and trajectory is. And then we'll go back to Tanya.
For sure. Thank you for having me, first of all. I just wanted to start off by saying this is a great discussion, and I think that both of the speakers that have spoken so far are completely on point. I think that the Republican Party has focused on issues this election cycle that Americans actually care about, especially in a time like this. And I think that the reason for this is the Democrat Party's maybe hyperfixation on identity politics and cultural issues, if you will, during a time where people actually care more about the economy, care more about how many jobs and what the labor market is looking like. And so this reminded me of kind of a funny saying that I'd heard a while ago, and it was that you're progressive until you're paying taxes. And I thought that was kind of humorous, but it really is what's happening. And as someone who, this will be the first time I'm voting, it's my first election cycle, and I saw that in 2016, a lot of my peers were afraid of Donald Trump being in office. There was a very, very far left leaning Generation Z. And we've seen a marked shift in my own generation from people who thought that Donald Trump was enemy number one, the villain, to maybe he's the better option that we have right now. And I think that this is because one, young people are starting to work and starting to be employed, and they're seeing the effects of the Democratic Party on the job market, on the economy, and they're seeing that maybe there's more to politics than just cultural issues and identity politics, which is what the Democratic Party is primarily focused on. But also that young Americans, especially young American boys, have started to shift markedly towards the right. We haven't seen that big of a shift with young American women, obviously because of issues like Roe v. Wade, abortion, women's rights, etc. But seeing such a big shift within young American boys, Gen Z and millennial men is monumental. That being said, the issue or the demographic that I thought that the Republicans actually had a stronghold in that they haven't really been nurturing much is immigrants, minorities. And we talked about this earlier today, and we've seen that more Black Americans, more Hispanic Americans have started voting Republican, started voting conservative. And we've seen for the last few election cycles that there is a large percentage of East Asian Americans, Indian Americans who have consistently voted Republican. But when we look at the numbers of people that are that the Republican Party is catering to, we don't see minorities as the grand majority of people that they are playing to get votes from. And so I think that the Republican Party needs to recognize that their stronghold isn't just Caucasian straight male Americans anymore. It is minorities, it is Indian Americans, East Asian Americans. They can play on Hispanic Americans and Black Americans. And these are strongholds that they can have. These are people that they are willing to vote for the Republican Party if the Republican Party goes out to them and talks about issues that matter to them. Now, I think that one other stronghold that the Republican Party can play on is moderates. We've seen that moderates tend to lean conservative this election cycle, primarily because of economics. And because of that, we've seen that a lot of moderates have started to turn to maybe like moderate rights and like middle centrists, and they've started voting Republican. And so playing on that moderate centrist population would be really beneficial for the Republican Party. Now, that being said, the Republican Party isn't perfect right now. We've seen that the Republican Party today is more divided than it was in previous elections. We've seen that the Republican Party is divided on the topic of Trump. They're divided on neoconservatism, which is something that Connor talked about earlier, where half of the party still believes that, yes, we should be doing everything we can in terms of foreign policy, extremely aggressive foreign policy, versus the other half, which is newer conservatives, saying that, oh, maybe we should step away from foreign policy issues and start focusing on internal domestic issues. And we've seen this through newer candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy, to an extent, Nikki Haley. And so seeing these new ideologies clash within the Republican Party is something that maybe Republicans should start being a little worried about. We saw this divisiveness in the Democratic Party last election cycle, and we're starting to see a new kind of rift within the Republican Party. And so being able to bridge their gaps and being able to find middle ground within the party, especially this election cycle, is really important in terms of bringing in new voters, especially those that are moderates, younger voters, etc. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jesne. And as you were talking, something that I thought a little bit about. So it seems that we've seen this kind of mentioned by all three of you thus far, that there's kind of this distinction being drawn between the identity politics of the Democratic Party and the economic focus of the Republican Party. Now, I'd imagine that a lot of people on the left could retort and basically say, well, these things are very, very closely connected. And, they could argue that, like, say, race plays an influence in one's socioeconomic opportunities, a big influence, that there is systemic and institutional racism, other forms of discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community, against other groups as well, that influence their economic standing. And so it would almost be from this perspective that identity politics is necessary to really address the fundamental causes of economic disparities. What's your reaction to this general position? And then after you've answered that, don't worry, Tanya, I haven't forgotten about you. We will get back to you.
Yeah, for sure. And you're completely right. There is a huge interlap between identity politics and economics. But when you look at the average American voter, they aren't drawing these connections. They aren't saying, oh, is there a reason that certain economic groups aren't succeeding as much as others? When they hear both parties' rhetoric, they're hearing one party say, oh, we are going to focus on race issues. We're going to focus on having more cultural diversity. And then we hear the other party saying, we're going to bring back jobs. We are going to make America economically, make America a political and economic hegemon again. As an American voter, you're not drawing those connections between, between identity politics and economics, or identity politics and hegemony. You are hearing that one side is going to bring back the jobs that everyone during COVID either lost their own jobs or knew someone that lost a job. There were hundreds of thousands of layoffs in so many industries that there was a clear issue that people were facing. Everybody faced some type of economic loss. And because of that, their priority was, how can we get back to pre-COVID, pre-Biden economic eras? How can we get back to not even being like the global power anymore, just being able to have jobs, being able to go to work every day, being able to afford basic necessities. And so when you hear the rhetoric of both parties, the Democratic Party should play on the fact that race and gender do play an important aspect in economics, but they don't. The Republican Party has been very clear on their standpoints about economics and about bringing jobs back. And when people are so emotionally driven and seen that they have lost so many jobs, all they want is those jobs back, is to be able to go to a grocery store and not pay 5 times their like grocery store bill than they did 5 years ago. And so as a voter, I think that being able to hear that very strong rhetoric on the Republican side has been monumental for Gen Z voters, but also centrist and moderate voters.
And Tanya, you had your hand up for a little bit there. Is there anything you'd like to respond to in terms of this conversation?
Well, for the first thing I really want to emphasize is that we are seeing a shift with the way the Republican Party approaches their own like marketing and tactics, right? I know Connor mentioned it. I kind of talked about it a little bit, but notably from a communication standpoint, because one of my degrees was speech communication. So I find this really interesting how language is used in these parties, is that they have moved from this hard language to more softer type of language, right? So notably, we can look at their stance on marriage, right? Back in 2010 or 2016, how they're saying we're for our traditional man and woman type of relationship, or that's what we want to support. And now in 2024, they're here saying that we're looking to empower families. So there's a very big difference in what type of language they're using. We typically call this soft language. Now, there could be a couple of reasons why they're doing this. The first part is they want to get those conservatives who sometimes go liberal, or they're moderates, right? Or the other part is that they want to appear to be more encompassing, right? Being the thing that some Democrats want, right? So those are some things we can look for in the upcoming presidential election, right? How are they going to soften their language when it comes to the border? And they're already kind of doing that, right? And we look what Trump did in 2016. Trump was very much saying, oh, help me get rid of the migrant influx. And now they're saying secure the borders for our own American prosperity and freedom, right? So we're seeing this language shift happening. Now, are they using the same methods? That's something entirely differently, right? And in the conversation of identity politics and economics, right? I think, ¿por qué no los dos, right? Why can the Republican Party use identity politics in their own way to then get those who are concerned about how like systemic racism has plagued people's lives, right? Can we have both? Can but like probably not. Probably won't use identity politics in that type of way, but there could be a way that they could use that, right? In saying that we understand now how systemic factors could impact people's economic position in life, but we believe our position is different from the Democrats nonetheless, right? Their policy approach can be different, but they could recognize it, but I don't see them doing that in the future.
I think a lot of what Josny was saying is really really pertinent to what's going on right now in our political climate. I think that you pretty much hit the nail on the head when you said that voters aren't, they're not looking at these nuances, these alleged nuances that have been preached to the choir by the proponents of identity politics on the left. It's just the apparent connection between economic prosperity and so forth, between that and identity politics. It's not all that clear to the average American. I think from what I'm observing among people my age, it feels as if people are observing identity politics in practice. You have identity politics in theory, and then you have identity politics as it actually manifests in the real world. And this is just, this is something that you see with every ideology. There's the ideology in theory written on paper. There's Marxism written on paper as written in the Communist Manifesto, and then there's Marxism in practice as we observed in the real world last century. And those two things are very different things. And I think Americans, average Americans, many of whom are apolitical, mind you, a lot of these people are starting to get a little irritated with identity politics, and they're not seeing the apparent benefits of it. And I think a lot of people are observing that it's only perhaps contributed to more division among and between Americans. I think that we've turned a national unifying identity that's something that has acted as the foundation, the foundation of our cultural fabric for hundreds of years now, and we've fractured it into a litany of different smaller identities. And I don't think that that's something that's served us well. I think it's only pitted people into their corners, and people, are identifying themselves based off of not as an American, but as, oh, I'm this person, or I'm this shade of brown, or I'm that shade of brown, or I identify as this or as that as my sexuality. And I think that a lot of people are just like apolitical people are starting to observe on the streets that it's like, man, like, I really don't care like who you are, what you identify as, or where you come from. I thought we were all Americans. Like, it didn't used to be like this 20 years ago, and it didn't. So I think that Americans are starting to observe identity politics in practice, and they're saying, okay, maybe this isn't the best course. Maybe this is something that's actually contributing to the further fracturing of the American identity and the division and polarization of Americans, despite its good intentions. So I think a lot of what you were saying, Jocelyn, makes a lot of sense.
So it seems to me kind of maybe the point of agreement that the three speakers we have here have sort of arrived at is that the Republican Party's rhetoric that doesn't focus on identity politics, but just the direct economic issues is a strategic boon for the party. That it's performing well, particularly among, at least increasingly among, Gen Z voters as a result, and that a more direct focus on identity politics in practice hasn't really worked out so well. We've talked a lot about the Republican Party's shifts in languages. Tanya, you mentioned kind of a shift over towards the soft language as a strategic gain for the Republican Party. But to finish our conversation off here, I wanted to ask each of you, even if this shift is strategic, do you think that's, maybe as a more fundamental question, like it's a morally good thing? That, if we just focus directly on these economic issues and not maybe more fundamental systemic issues, if those are the root causes of economic inequalities that we see today, like, do you think that that's a good thing, or do you think that there's a way for the Republican Party to better acknowledge those issues without getting into, as Connor said, identity politics in practice, where you see a lot of division and it creates a lot of fraction within the party, fracture within the party? Yeah, just what are your thoughts there? Well, just anyone who wants to speak initially on this.
Strategically, it's good that they're doing that because they want to come off as a more accepting party, right? Because we all understand and know the Republican Party has traditionally been, has been a lot of white voters, but they want to get rid of that image. They want to look at it as an image of an American party, a unified party, a party where you have an identity, and the identity is American, and the goal is getting the American dream. Right? So strategically, it's good. Now, whether or not they can actually do policy that is actually going to affect change is different, right? Let's look at this idea of racial inequality, like economic racial inequality. Republicans lean for a more individual way, or sorry, I think it's called individual way, individualistic approaches to addressing this, right? And there are Democrats utilize an institutionalization or institutional way of approaching it, right? There could be a mix of the two the Republican Party can then propose, right? And so in the way they are addressing that, there is, systemic racism that is impacting their voters, and they have a way to approach it that isn't as extreme as the left, right? They could definitely use that strategically, whether or not they actually like feel into it, it's a completely different thing, right? So strategically is a good thing, just coming from a political communication standpoint, yeah, strategically it's good and it's going to work, right? You're gonna get those, conservative Gen Zs who are a bit more liberal, right? Because a lot of Gen Z is a bit more liberal, right? A lot of Gen Z is more accepting when it comes to LGBTQ plus. I'm probably saying that wrong. And there is more accepting when it comes to like, I guess, having the perspective that there is inequalities that cannot be addressed without a identity politics lens, right? It's just at that point they call it common sense. Right, but that's again my own perspective when it comes into there, right? So strategically, very effective and much needed for Republican Party. Morally, I can't hold. What do we define as being moral, right? Are we?
It's a big question.
It's a whole different thing. But strategically, it's good. Is it actually going to work? I don't know. Just because they have had this perspective or this connotation of being, a white party, or a connotation of being a very not immigrant accepting party. So it's going to take a lot of work to overturn that perspective, especially when it comes to Black and Hispanic voters, even if they are able to paint the picture of American dream.
Yeah, really quick, I just wanted to touch on something Tanya said that also links back to what Jocelyn was saying earlier. Tanya, you mentioned that Gen Z is an inclusive generation, which I think we are largely. I mean, I think that I don't think we're any more or less inclusive than previous generations. I think that we as Americans, we've always been supporters of the core tenets of classical liberalism. Religious pluralism has always been something that that America has been supportive of, the right to free speech and free expression and so forth. These are just the core tenets of Western liberal democracy. And I think we're just seeing, an increased a spectrum of expression nowadays. However, this ties back into what Jocelyn was saying. she mentioned that, you know, there is a massive divide, and she's right. There's a massive divide between Gen Z men and Gen Z women. And it is really, really concerning, you know, to some people on the right, you know, it may be an appropriate reaction, or it might be a movement that of, or a new, this is kind of the new brand of conservatism among really young Americans that I was talking about earlier, this kind of like paleo conservatism that we haven't seen in a long, long time. But there, she was right when she said there's a massive divide between young men and young women. And now young Gen Z men are, you know, polls are showing that they are tilting so far to the right, that further right than, you know, pretty much any generation of young American men in the history of America. Um, and, you know, conservatives in America are conservatives, you know, especially when you compare them with other parts of the Western world, Europe and so forth. So, I mean, American conservatives have always been known worldwide as, you know, the most conservative conservatives in the Western world. So, you know, imagining this um, this new paradigm that's emerging where young men are becoming even more conservative. It's really, I think a lot of it is a reaction to identity politics, which tends to from what I'm seeing and from the conversations I'm having with younger Americans these days, and from what I'm observing in online forums and so forth, the general consensus seems to be that a lot of, oftentimes, identity politics might disenfranchise young men at the expense of promoting progress in other areas. So there's an upside and a downside to it. And so I think what we're seeing, this reaction, this neo paleo conservatism, this really, really old school conservatism that, you know, if it were to take hold in years down the line, when, you know, these young men who are now in their early 20s get into power in a couple decades, then it could manifest itself in a way that could really just completely flip the scales of what we're seeing now. And, you know, I'm not trying to sound alarmist or anything. I'm trying to be completely realistic and look at you know, we can't afford to ignore these sorts of trends or these realities that are taking place. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, and that, you know, we could have the social order that as it exists now, you know, it could be flipped on its head, completely 180. You know, people think that we've reached the end of history. And when you know, when you take any class at a university these days in the Western world, the general consensus, unbelievably to me, is that we've reached the end of history, that this is the summation of human progress, and that society will remain this way, and the social order that's emerged in recent years will remain this way for the rest of time. And I think that's just honestly a little naive. You know, history runs in cycles and the pendulum swings. And so I think it's important to be mindful of this, because we don't want the pendulum to swing all the way back from where we're at now to a point where, you know, we see a redaction in women's rights and so forth. And you know, we need to, I think there's a balance between the two extremes, and that's something that we want to aim to strike. But I think the problem with the left nowadays is that they're so focused on progress and this sort of idea, that I think they're blind to what's emerging in the shadows. They don't want to acknowledge it because it's kind of ugly to talk about. So my point is that, you know, I think it's dangerous to say that you know, all of Gen Z is you know, on board with this sort of you know, very like progressive, and like very like, what it is like this sort of identity politics paradigm. I think young Gen Z women are very far to the left, and they are the ones who support this new ideological paradigm. But young Gen Z men, they don't even talk to other Gen Z women. You know, nobody's dating anymore. Young men aren't having sex anymore, which is unhealthy. Like there's nobody's having relationships with each other. You know, it's like obviously like people need to get married and reproduce for, you know, for the health of the country, for the health of the economy. If birth rates collapse, which is what's happening right now because the sexes have never been more farther apart from each other than they are now, that has serious negative repercussions. Like we need to make sure that young men aren't going to jump out of the shadows one day and turn the clock back essentially. You know, we need to keep an eye on that for the well-being of America.
Thank you, Connor. That was really interesting. Jasne, we're gonna you know, I'd love to kind of react to some of what's being discussed here, but we're gonna go to you. So you can give your thoughts on this, and then I, as the moderator, can kind of just facilitate things. But the very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what Connor said. And I think that when we look at and we've seen such a big shift, he's so right about women and men in especially my generation have never been so far apart in terms of ideology and politics. And when we look at what's created this, we see that because we went so extremely progressive, the pendulum is going to shift extremely conservative as well. And it's difficult, especially in a time like this, to find that middle ground and find ideas that we all agree on. And so I think that the Democratic Party, I think, inadvertently created this new monster of an extreme right movement of young men that at some point in the future will surface and haunt not just the Republican Party but America as a whole. That being said, I do want to go back to your original question about the morality and kind of the standpoint that the Republican Party has taken. And I think that Tanya touched on this earlier, and I really liked the wording that she used, saying that the Republican Party has kind of turned into the American Party. We've seen that Democrats have focused so much on identity politics and so much on specific individualism and specific, like grouping people into certain sects and groups, having like Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Caucasian Americans, Asian Americans, and we're all so different from each other. We're all different categories. We can't exist as one America. We exist as Black Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans. And then on top of that, the second layer being that we're all pit against each other for some reason. We see that there are privileged groups and there are unprivileged groups. And the problem with creating these quote unquote privileged and unprivileged groups is that people are inadvertently put in categories or stereotypes that they may not fit in. Telling an African American or a Hispanic American that you are quote unquote underprivileged from the start, it can be demotivating. You don't want a party to keep on telling you that you are different just because of your skin color. That's why we see a lot of Black Americans, a lot of Hispanic Americans actually begin to move away from the Democratic Party that claims to be working for them. And we see that they're moving towards the Republican Party now because they don't want to be separated from other Americans. We see primarily white Americans, Asian Americans who have been put in this quote unquote like privileged category where they have to be sorry for maybe for having maybe more economic status or having certain privileges. We see that they are socially punished for this in a way, especially by the media, by the Democratic Party. They're always told that they can't have real issues because they are quote unquote privileged. And so we see that all groups are starting to slowly move to either the center or the right because people don't want to be separated anymore. People want to see themselves as Americans. People want to see themselves as Americans first before they are African American, before they are Asian American, before they're Hispanic American. And the commonality between all of these are that they are all Americans. And we have seen that the Republican Party time and time again has stressed this notion that we are all Americans first. Now, obviously, their rhetoric could use work. I completely believe that moving a little bit to a moderate, maybe centrist viewpoint in terms of identity politics would be very beneficial for the Republican Party. That being said, I think that it's very powerful, and I'd just really quickly like to share a little. There was a really viral trend, or not trend, sorry, like a story that happened a while ago where the national anthem, they decided not to sing the national anthem at like a school baseball game, and parents decided that no, we are going to sing the national anthem. We are Americans first. And we see that this entire row, this stadium of parents of all different races, genders, everything, they stand up, and together you can hear that Americans are singing the American anthem on their own. And it is so powerful to see that we see this like myriad of different people from completely different socioeconomic and social backgrounds, and the one thing that's uniting them is being American. They're singing the American anthem. They are proud of being American. And so stressing that pride, being the party that is always America first, is very, very beneficial for the Republican Party. And I think that it's very important to recognize that there are identity differences between economic and social groups, but the Republican Party shouldn't handle that the way the Democratic Party has, where they have divided Americans instead of uniting them. And so I think the moral thing to do here really is to remind Americans that before there are any other identity, they are Americans. And so the one thing that unites us is being from this country called America. And yes, America has its faults, but we will work together to fix this country instead of hating it, instead of wanting to leave, instead of saying that, oh, America is the worst country on earth, like any other country would be better than the United States. So I think this rhetoric that the Democratic Party has used, it has been detrimental to not only the party, but the culture of America.
Thank you for that perspective, Jesne. I think that there is a very big divide in contrast in the rhetoric used. But certainly it's a very, very big and interesting question as to the morality of acknowledging all of these facets, whether in acknowledging structural issues that exist, you're sort of putting down a certain group, demotivating them, or whether you're attempting to address the root causes of issues to uplift them. There's it's a very, very nuanced topic, and I thank you for how forcefully you've presented kind of your take on that issue. Now we are going to have to wrap up here in just a sec, but Tanya, you do have your hand up.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think the information Connor provided that Gen Z men are becoming more conservative isn't really new news, right? Like men have always really have leaned conservatively, right? So that's not really new information. I don't think it's something we should be scared of, right? But I don't think he was meaning for us to be scared of it anyway. But I think though, I don't think Gen Z men are more conservative. I think they're more moderate, right? I don't really see them engaging in some type of Republican antics that we have seen before in the past, right? And that's because we're seeing a cultural shift. We're seeing a different way how Gen Z has approached politics. And from my own perspective, now this is going to be very different from what Connor and Jashne has said, right? Is that I don't believe either party has been unifying Americans. I don't think either of them have a unifying identity because both of them, the left, they're fighting each other. The right is fighting each other, right? They're fighting over what is more dominant identity, and that is causing Gen Z more likely to lean moderate. Even though they're more Democrat, they're still pretty moderate in some sense. They're kind of going back and forth on who they really want to lean into. Now, that could be the fault of the two-party system, right? Not having the options available where they could say, oh, I'll go green this time because at this very moment, I'm more leaning green, right? They don't have that opportunity. They don't have that choice here at the very moment. So there's something else you can discuss, but that's probably a whole different discussion, right? On giving Gen Z the option to vote differently, right? But I do think, though, that that's why ONC is here, right? We want to be a unifying voice. We want Gen Z to actually find a place in politics because I think, in my own perspective, I, for myself, do not see myself with the Republican Party. I don't see myself with the Democratic Party anyway. Though there are some things that each of them have that I love, that I want to see more, right? For example, the Republican side, I want to see more of the I am American identity. Like, I am American first, I'm something else after. American first, but I'm Mexican after that. Right. So like I'd rather be fueled by that. But also you have the Democrat Party, where I really value the lens of, you know, using the lens of the systemic racism, understanding that there are going to be barriers because of our own history, our own faults. And that's just commonplace. And, you know, only 65 years ago, I wasn't allowed in schools. Like, you know, that's what we have to acknowledge, understand that those people with those identities or those perspectives still exist today, right? So isn't that far from now? That's like 3 grandparents. It isn't that old, right? So, and you know, so that's something I just wanted, my immediate reaction.
You know, if I want to try to attempt to summarize generally what's been discussed here, because it's a lot. As I said before, I think that we're kind of agreeing here that the general trajectory of the Republican Party, at least if it doesn't lean too far into extremely divisive rhetoric that villainizes certain groups, if it steers away from that, that it's doing something that's a strategic good, right? Especially if it's trying to court Gen Z voters. But when we get into this more fundamental question of, you know, what's the morally best direction for the Republican Party's rhetoric to take, whether you know, it's being vigilant against really far right, you know, Gen Z young men who might be tending towards a more extreme view that could turn us back a little bit in history, or whether Gen Z is actually leaning away from both parties towards some sort of moderate centrist position, whether we should be acknowledging factors of identity politics in order to address fundamental causes of socioeconomic disparities, or whether in doing that we're putting people down. I think these are questions which, you know, I'd love to discuss more. I think there's a lot to get into there. And that's probably where, you know, we continue to have very differing perspectives. But at the very least, I think we've made some progress in this conversation. We've identified different perspectives on the Republican Party. So let's see how the Republican convention plays out, and we'll go from there. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and have a fantastic rest of your day.